Imagine two of the most powerful warships ever built by human hands sailing side by side in the same ocean, each one carrying more aircraft than most nations own in their entire air force, and both of them pointed at the same target. That image, that raw, staggering concentration of naval power, is not a scene from a Hollywood blockbuster. It is something that happened repeatedly, deliberately, and with enormous geopolitical consequences in the Western Pacific between 2017 and 2025. And if you have never stopped to truly understand why the United States Navy kept doing this, what it meant, who it was meant to frighten, and whether it actually worked, then you are about to have one of the most eye-opening 60 minutes of your life. Welcome. Today we are going inside the world of dual carrier operations in the Western Pacific. We are going to talk about steel and jet fuel and admirals sitting in darkened command centers making decisions that ripple outward into the foreign ministries of Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow. We are going to talk about the choreography of two nuclear-powered aircraft carriers operating in the same airspace, which is one of the most complicated things the United States military knows how to do. And we are going to talk about whether this extraordinary show of force actually accomplishes what it is designed to accomplish, or whether it is something more complicated, more dangerous, and more fascinating than a simple message of deterrence. But before we get into all of that, we need to lay the foundation. We need to understand what a dual carrier operation actually is, because it is not simply two ships sailing near each other. It is an event. It is a coordinated, synchronized, choreographed deployment of roughly 200 aircraft, 20 support ships, 15,000 sailors and aviators, and enough firepower to reshape the military balance of an entire region for the weeks it is in place. Understanding the scale of this thing is essential to understanding why nations notice it, why adversaries respond to it, and why the United States keeps choosing it as a tool of strategic communication. An American aircraft carrier strike group is already, by itself, one of the most formidable military instruments ever created. At its center sits the carrier itself, a ship roughly 330 meters long, displacing around 100,000 tons of water, powered by two nuclear reactors that never need refueling for the life of the ship. On its flight deck and in its hangars live approximately 70 to 90 aircraft, strike fighters, electronic warfare planes, early warning aircraft, helicopters. Around the carrier travels a screen of guided missile cruisers and destroyers, submarines hunting beneath the surface, and a supply ship that allows the group to stay at sea for months without returning to port. Each carrier strike group, operating alone, represents a force that can project air power over a radius of roughly 1,000 kilometers in any direction. It can launch sustained strikes. It can defend itself against aircraft, missiles, and submarines simultaneously. It is, as naval analysts often describe it, a movable sovereign piece of territory. Now double it. Put two of those strike groups in the same operating area, coordinated under a single tactical command structure, their aircraft sharing the same airspace according to a carefully deconflicted flight schedule, their surface combatants extending the defensive perimeter outward to a scale that covers hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of ocean. The strike package that two carriers can put together is not simply twice as powerful as one carrier's. It is qualitatively different. Two carriers can sustain around-the-clock strike operations with far greater redundancy. They can overwhelm defensive systems that might be able to handle one carrier's attack profile. They can split adversary attention and planning in ways that create genuine tactical and strategic dilemmas. And politically, symbolically, visually, the image of two carriers conducting flight operations together sends a message that is unmistakable to anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of military power. The Western Pacific is the perfect stage for this kind of theater, and it is not an accident that this is where the United States has concentrated these operations. The region contains some of the most strategically important waterways on Earth: the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Philippine Sea, the Luzon Strait, the Taiwan Strait. These are choke points and corridors through which trillions of dollars of global trade flow every year. They are also the geographic space in which China's expanding military ambitions have collided most directly with the interests of American allies, American partners, and the American strategic vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. To understand why 2017 marks the beginning of the period we are examining, you have to understand what was happening in that year across the region. North Korea was accelerating its ballistic missile testing program at a pace that alarmed the entire international community. In the span of a few months in 2017, Pyongyang tested its first intercontinental ballistic missiles, conducted its sixth and most powerful nuclear test, and launched missiles over Japanese territory. The crisis was real and acute, and the Trump administration was publicly threatening military options in language that was more direct and alarming than anything an American president had used about North Korea in years. The phrase fire and fury entered the global vocabulary. The world was watching the Korean peninsula and wondering whether a conflict was genuinely possible. It was against this backdrop that the United States Navy deployed 2 carrier strike groups to the Western Pacific simultaneously in the autumn of 2017, centering on the USS Ronald Reagan, which is home port in Yokosuka, Japan, and the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which had sailed from its home port on the West Coast. The 2 groups conducted joint exercises in the Philippine Sea in late October of that year, and the message was deliberately and explicitly calibrated toward Pyongyang. American officials said so openly. This was a demonstration of capability and resolve, a signal to Kim Jong-un's government that the United States had the capacity to overwhelm North Korean defenses if it chose to act. But something else was happening simultaneously, something that many observers at the time noticed, but that has become far clearer in retrospect. The dual carrier exercise was also a signal to Beijing. China's military, the People's Liberation Army, had been watching the North Korea crisis with its own concerns. It did not want a war on its border, and it did not want American military action that might destabilize the Korean peninsula. But China was also watching the American carrier deployment very carefully for a different reason entirely. The People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan, had been investing enormous resources in what military strategists call anti-access and area denial capabilities, systems specifically designed to threaten and potentially destroy American carriers operating in the Western Pacific. The Chinese were developing carrier killer ballistic missiles, specifically the Dongfeng 21D and later the Dongfeng 26, weapons designed to strike moving ships at ranges of up to 4,000 kilometers. They were building fleets of submarines. They were deploying shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles on islands in the South China Sea. The entire strategic architecture of Chinese military investment in the early 21st century was oriented around the idea of making American carriers too vulnerable to operate freely in Chinese-claimed waters. The dual carrier operation in 2017 was, among other things, the American Navy saying, "We see your investment. We understand what you are trying to do, and we are telling you that it has not worked, that we are still here, that we will continue to operate in these waters, and that if you believe you can hold our carriers at risk, you should think carefully about whether you are willing to test that theory." It was a statement of operational confidence. It was also, inevitably, a provocation, not in the legal sense, because the United States was operating in international waters, but in the political and strategic sense, because it challenged Chinese claims to dominance over the near seas. The year 2018 brought a different flavor of dual carrier operations. The strategic environment was shifting. The North Korea crisis had not escalated into war, and by the spring of 2018, the diplomatic temperature was dropping as talks between Washington and Pyongyang began. But the South China Sea was heating up. China had by 2018 completed its artificial island construction program in the Spratly Islands, turning submerged reefs and small outcroppings into military installations equipped with runways, radar systems, missile batteries, and barracks. The United States and its allies viewed this as a challenge to the international law of the sea and to the principle of freedom of navigation. American warships were conducting freedom of navigation operations, sailing close to the Chinese-claimed artificial islands to assert that they were not sovereign Chinese territory under international law. The dual-carrier exercises in 2018 were larger, more complex, and more deliberately publicized than those of the previous year. The Navy was learning how to use these events not just as military rehearsals, but as communication tools. Press embeds were organized. Footage of two carriers conducting simultaneous flight operations, a sight genuinely spectacular to anyone who sees it, was released to the media. Defense officials gave briefings explaining, in terms carefully designed for public consumption, what the exercises demonstrated about American capability. The information warfare component of dual-carrier operations was becoming as sophisticated as the operational planning. What the Navy was doing in 2018 was also responding to a deeper institutional debate that had been occurring within the American defense community for several years. That debate centered on a fundamental question: were American carriers still survivable in a high-end conflict against China? Critics within the defense establishment, most prominently a group of analysts associated with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments and later with the Hudson Institute, argued that Chinese investments in anti-access and area denial had fundamentally changed the calculus, that carriers operating within the first island chain would be sitting targets for Chinese missiles, and that the entire concept of carrier-based power projection needed to be rethought. Proponents of the carrier, including much of the institutional Navy, argued that the critics were overstating Chinese capabilities, that carriers had layers of defensive systems that the critics underestimated, and that the ability to project credible force into a contested environment was itself a strategic asset that could not be surrendered without enormous cost. The dual-carrier operations were partly the Navy's way of demonstrating operationally what it was arguing institutionally, that it could operate in the Western Pacific, that it could do so effectively, and that the critics who had written off the carrier were wrong. This internal American debate had direct consequences for how the exercises were designed. The Navy was not simply sailing ships in circles. It was testing and demonstrating specific operational concepts. Could two carrier strike groups coordinate their air wings effectively while maintaining sufficient separation to be tactically independent? Could they share tanking assets and airborne early warning coverage without creating choke points in the logistics chain that an adversary could exploit? Could they conduct joint strike planning in a degraded communications environment? Which was a critical question because Chinese electronic warfare capabilities were designed specifically to disrupt the kind of bandwidth-intensive coordination that American carrier operations typically require. These were real operational questions, and the exercises in 2018 and 2019 were partly designed to generate real answers. The geography of these exercises is worth examining in detail, because where the carriers operated tells you as much as what they were doing. The Philippine Sea, the broad expanse of ocean east of the Philippines and south of Japan, became the primary operating area for most dual-carrier exercises during this period. This was deliberate. The Philippine Sea is outside the first island chain, meaning it is in waters that are less directly contested by Chinese area denial capabilities. Operating there allowed the United States to demonstrate capability and resolve while maintaining a degree of operational distance from the most dangerous zones. But the exercises also probed inward. Transits through the Philippine Sea toward the South China Sea, approaches to the Luzon Strait, operations in the vicinity of Taiwan. These maneuvers were chosen with care, each one testing a specific point on the map that corresponded to a specific strategic question. In 2019, the operational tempo increased. 3 carrier strike groups were simultaneously deployed to the Western Pacific during the summer of that year, a concentration of naval power not seen since the Cold War. The USS Ronald Reagan was on station in the Western Pacific as the forward deployed carrier. The USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS John C. Stennis were operating in the region simultaneously. 3 carrier strike groups together represent something close to a wartime surge posture, and the message was unmistakable. This was the United States Navy demonstrating that it could operate at peak intensity for extended periods in the most contested maritime environment on Earth. Chinese military observers, who monitored every move of these carrier groups with a network of satellites, surveillance aircraft, and naval vessels, were watching. And Beijing's own defense analysis community was debating, urgently, what the American posture meant and how China should respond. The COVID-19 pandemic created a unique and chaotic episode in the history of dual carrier operations that deserves careful examination. In March 2020, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, one of the most capable carriers in the American fleet, was struck by a severe outbreak of the novel coronavirus among its crew. The commanding officer, Captain Brett Crozier, sent a letter to Navy leadership pleading for resources to quarantine his crew and halt the spread of the disease, warning that hundreds of sailors were at risk. The letter was leaked to the media. Crozier was subsequently relieved of command in a decision that generated enormous controversy. The carrier itself was sidelined in Guam for weeks while more than 1,000 sailors tested positive for the virus. The episode was significant beyond its immediate human tragedy because it revealed something about the vulnerability of the carrier as a platform. Not vulnerability to Chinese missiles or submarines, but vulnerability to a microscopic pathogen that could spread through a closed community of thousands of people living in close quarters. The carrier's sidelining during the Roosevelt crisis left a visible gap in American Pacific coverage, and that gap was noted, analyzed, and almost certainly exploited informationally by adversaries who pointed to it as evidence of American military fragility. The dual carrier concept depends on the ability to sustain operations over time, and the Roosevelt episode demonstrated that human factors, illness, morale, leadership crises, could disrupt that continuity in ways that technical adversaries might not be able to achieve. The pandemic years of 2020 and 2021 were complicated for Pacific carrier operations generally. Port calls were restricted. Sailor movement was constrained. Planning timelines were disrupted. But the Navy adapted, and the commitment to maintaining a forward presence in the Western Pacific did not waver. Modified dual carrier exercises continued, sometimes with different groups of ships than had originally been planned, sometimes with reduced numbers of aircraft or personnel, but continuing. The operational continuity was itself a message that American forward presence in the Pacific was not optional, not a peacetime luxury that would be suspended under pressure, but a strategic commitment that would be maintained regardless of circumstances. As the pandemic receded and 2022 arrived, the geopolitical environment in the Western Pacific had intensified dramatically. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 had profound implications for the Pacific, even though it was occurring on the other side of the Eurasian landmass. The invasion demonstrated that major powers were willing to use military force to alter international borders in ways that many analysts had assumed were no longer possible. For Taiwan, the implications were immediate and alarming. If Russia could invade Ukraine, why could China not invade Taiwan? The comparison was imperfect in many ways. The military challenges of a cross-strait amphibious operation are qualitatively different from a land invasion across a flat border. But the psychological and political effect of the Ukraine war on Taiwanese strategic thinking and on American commitments to Taiwan's defense was enormous. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August 2022 triggered the most serious military exercise by China around Taiwan in decades. The People's Liberation Army conducted what it described as joint military exercises that encircled Taiwan, firing ballistic missiles over the island, launching extensive air and naval exercises in the waters surrounding it. The exercises were widely interpreted as a rehearsal for a blockade or military action, and they generated an immediate American response. The USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group was positioned in waters to the east of Taiwan during the crisis, a visible deterrent presence. A second carrier, the USS America, technically a large amphibious assault ship rather than a nuclear carrier, but capable of operating F-35B fighters, was also positioned nearby. The United States was once again using carrier presence as a tool of crisis communication, signaling resolve to Beijing while simultaneously reassuring Taipei and allied governments in Tokyo and Seoul. The lessons of the August 2022 Taiwan crisis were studied intensively by military planners on all sides. American analysts noted that the Chinese military exercises had achieved a degree of sophistication and coordination that exceeded what many had projected even a few years earlier. The PLA's ability to simultaneously conduct air operations, naval surface and submarine operations, missile firings, and information warfare operations in a coordinated fashion indicated a genuine capability leap. But American analysts also noted that the exercises had limitations, that Chinese forces had not attempted to penetrate the defensive perimeters that would exist if American carriers were present, and that the exercises had been conducted in a permissive environment without active opposition. The presence of the Ronald Reagan during the crisis, they argued, was itself a factor in shaping what China chose to do and not to do. The year 2023 brought the dual carrier concept to its most sophisticated iteration yet during this period. The Navy conducted multiple dual carrier exercises in the Philippine Sea, refining the operational concepts that had been developed over the preceding 6 years. The exercises by 2023 were incorporating elements that would have been impossible a decade earlier. Fifth-generation aircraft, specifically the F-35C carrier variant, were now deployed in significant numbers on American carriers, giving the air wings a stealth capability that fundamentally changed the strike calculus. An adversary planning defenses against a carrier strike group in 2015 was planning against a force composed almost entirely of fourth-generation aircraft. By 2023, that adversary had to account for significant numbers of fifth-generation aircraft capable of penetrating defended airspace that would defeat older platforms. The integration of F-35s into dual carrier operations created new tactical possibilities that planners were actively exploring during this period. 2 carriers, each operating a mix of F-35CS and F/A-18 Super Hornets, could theoretically employ the F-35s as penetrating sensors, using their superior stealth and sensors to map adversary air defenses, while holding the Super Hornets at standoff range to deliver long-range weapons. The combination created a kind of distributed lethality that was greater than the sum of its parts. Military analysts who had written off the carrier in the early 2010s as too vulnerable began to revise their assessments as the capability of the air wing evolved. But the strategic conversation was also evolving in ways that complicated the picture. By 2023, China's Navy had grown dramatically. The People's Liberation Army Navy had commissioned its 3rd aircraft carrier, the Fujian, in 2022, a ship equipped with electromagnetic catapult launch systems similar to those used on American Ford-class carriers, representing a significant qualitative leap beyond China's previous carriers. China's submarine fleet had expanded. Its surface combatant fleet included growing numbers of destroyers and cruisers equipped with capable anti-ship missiles. The question was no longer whether China was a naval power of significance, but whether it was approaching the ability to contest American naval superiority in its near seas in ways that could genuinely threaten carrier operations. American response to this growing Chinese capability was multifaceted, and dual carrier operations were only one element of a broader strategic posture. The United States was deepening its alliance relationships across the Pacific. The AUKUS partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom, announced in 2021, was designed in part to extend the American submarine capability in the Pacific by helping Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines. The Quad partnership with Japan, Australia, and India was providing diplomatic and intelligence sharing frameworks. American forces were gaining access to new bases and facilities in the Philippines following a defense agreement that expanded American military presence there significantly. The dual-carrier operations were happening within this broader context of alliance deepening and strategic positioning, and their effect was amplified by the network of partners who were watching and drawing their own conclusions about American commitment to the region. Japan's role in this period deserves particular attention. Japan is not simply a host nation for American forces. It is the most militarily capable American ally in the Pacific and a nation whose own defense posture was undergoing its most dramatic transformation since the end of World War II. In 2022 and 2023, the Japanese government announced plans to double its defense spending over 5 years, acquire long-range cruise missile capabilities, and develop what it described as counter-strike capabilities, the ability to strike missile launchers on an adversary's territory before they fire. This was a profound shift from Japan's post-war pacifist strategic tradition. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force was also increasingly participating in dual-carrier exercises, sometimes deploying its own destroyers to operate in coordination with American carrier groups. The interoperability between American and Japanese naval forces was deepening in ways that multiplied the effective power of the American Pacific posture. South Korea's participation in the dual-carrier environment during this period followed a somewhat different trajectory. Seoul's security focus remained primarily centered on the North Korean threat, and South Korean defense planners were watching the North's continued missile and nuclear development with acute concern. But the South Korean Navy was also modernizing rapidly, acquiring its own carrier-capable ship and developing capabilities that made it a more capable partner for combined operations. Korean participation in exercises around American carrier deployments increased during this period, reflecting a broader trend of allied militaries in the Pacific integrating more tightly with American operational frameworks. The Australian dimension of Western Pacific dual-carrier operations is sometimes overlooked, but is strategically significant. Australian naval and air forces were increasingly participating in combined exercises in the Philippine Sea and adjacent waters, reflecting Canberra's deepening strategic alignment with Washington in response to concerns about China's regional behavior. The AUKUS partnership was not merely a submarine deal. It represented a fundamental decision by Australia to integrate its military posture more tightly with the United States across a range of domains, including naval operations in the Pacific. Australian frigates began appearing in the surface screen around American carrier strike groups during exercises in ways that would have been unusual even a decade earlier. The North Korea dimension of dual-carrier operations did not disappear after 2017, even as the focus increasingly shifted toward China. Pyongyang continued its missile testing program throughout this period, despite the brief diplomatic opening of 2018. By 2022 and 2023, North Korea had conducted dozens of ballistic missile tests, including multiple tests of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and had made significant advances in its nuclear weapons program. Kim Jong-un's government was openly discussing the operational deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. The threat calculus on the Korean peninsula remained serious, and American carrier presence in the region served a continuing deterrence function vis-a-vis Pyongyang, even as its primary strategic audience shifted increasingly toward Beijing. One of the most operationally interesting aspects of dual-carrier operations in this period was the challenge of logistics and sustainment. Two carrier strike groups together consume enormous quantities of aviation fuel, ordnance, food, spare parts, and fresh water. Keeping two groups operational in the Western Pacific simultaneously required a sustained logistics effort that stretched the capacity of the American Military Sealift Command. The forward logistics node at Guam was particularly important. The island's geographic position makes it the critical hub for resupply operations in the Central and Western Pacific, and American investment in Guam's military infrastructure during this period reflected an understanding that sustained dual-carrier operations required a robust logistics backbone. Concerns about Guam's vulnerability to Chinese missiles, which can reach the island, were a constant backdrop, to these discussions. The electromagnetic spectrum was another critical dimension of dual-carrier operations that the public rarely thinks about. Modern naval warfare takes place as much in the electromagnetic domain, radar, communications, electronic warfare, as it does in the physical domain of ships and aircraft. Two carrier strike groups operating together generate an enormous electromagnetic signature that is visible to adversary surveillance systems at great distances. Chinese intelligence-gathering ships, submarines equipped with signals intelligence equipment, and satellite systems were continuously monitoring American carrier operations in the Western Pacific throughout this period. The American side was simultaneously conducting offensive electronic intelligence gathering against Chinese military systems. The two sides were continuously reading each other's signals, probing each other's electronic order of battle, and learning about each other's capabilities. Dual-carrier operations thus served an intelligence-gathering function even as they served a deterrence function. They forced Chinese military systems to emit signals and respond in ways that American intelligence could observe and analyze. The cyber dimension of dual-carrier operations in this period also deserves attention, though it is the least visible of all. Both the United States and China were investing heavily in cyber capabilities designed to disrupt adversary military systems. A carrier strike group's operations depend on networked systems, navigation, communications, weapons targeting, logistics tracking, that are potential targets for cyber attack. The degree to which American carriers and their support ships were hardened against cyber attack, and the degree to which American offensive cyber capabilities could threaten Chinese military networks in a conflict, was a dimension of the dual-carrier equation that was rarely discussed publicly but was continuously analyzed by defense planners on both sides. Exercises during this period included cyber warfare scenarios alongside the more visible physical components of fleet operations. By 2024, the character of dual-carrier operations had evolved in several important ways from the exercises of 2017. The operational concepts were more refined. The Allied integration was deeper. The technology had advanced, with more fifth-generation aircraft, improved long-range anti-ship missiles like the Maritime Strike Tomahawk, and more sophisticated command and control systems. But the fundamental strategic logic remained the same. The United States was using the visible, credible presence of its most powerful naval assets to communicate resolve, demonstrate capability, and deter potential adversaries from actions that would destabilize the regional order. The Taiwan question hung over all of these operations like a storm cloud throughout the period. American policy on Taiwan remained deliberately ambiguous in its legal formulation. The United States acknowledged the Chinese position that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of China, but it did not accept or endorse that position, and it maintained the capacity to intervene militarily if Taiwan were attacked, under the Taiwan Relations Act. Chinese officials regularly and loudly asserted that Taiwan was an internal Chinese matter on which no foreign interference would be tolerated. American officials regularly and loudly asserted that the United States would maintain the capability to operate freely in international waters near Taiwan. This dialogue of assertion and counter-assertion was conducted partly through diplomatic channels and partly through military signaling, and dual-carrier operations were among the most powerful military signals in the American toolkit. The fundamental tension at the heart of dual-carrier deterrence in the Western Pacific is one that strategic theorists have grappled with for as long as there have been military balances to maintain. Deterrence works by convincing a potential adversary that the costs of an aggressive action exceed the benefits. But deterrence that is too credible, that makes the potential adversary feel genuinely threatened and cornered, can trigger the very conflict it is designed to prevent. This is the security dilemma at work. An action taken to increase one's own security decreases the adversary's sense of security and may prompt responses that make everyone less safe. Chinese analysts regularly argued that American carrier operations in the Western Pacific, particularly those that transited close to Taiwan or sailed into the South China Sea near Chinese claimed islands, were not defensive deterrence but offensive provocation, actions designed to challenge Chinese sovereignty and demonstrate American willingness to fight. American analysts regularly responded that Chinese military investments were the provocative actions, and that American carrier operations were a necessary response to maintain regional stability. This argument about who was provoking whom reflects a deeper disagreement about the regional order. China's government argued that the Western Pacific, at least the portion of it within the first island chain, was legitimately Chinese space, and that American carrier operations in that space were a form of military encroachment that China had every right to respond to. The United States government argued that the Western Pacific was international waters under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that freedom of navigation was a foundational principle of international order from which all nations benefited, and that Chinese claims to control the South China Sea were legally baseless and strategically dangerous. These were not arguments that could be resolved through military signaling alone, but military signaling was the vocabulary in which both sides chose to conduct much of the conversation. The operational risks of dual-carrier operations in the Western Pacific were real and occasionally manifested in dangerous incidents. Chinese naval and air forces regularly shadowed American carrier groups during this period, and there were multiple incidents of unsafe and unprofessional intercepts. Chinese fighter aircraft flying dangerously close to American aircraft, Chinese naval vessels maneuvering in ways that created collision risk with American ships. In May 2023, a Chinese destroyer crossed the bow of the USS Chung Hoon, an American destroyer operating with a Canadian frigate in the Taiwan Strait, at a distance of less than 500 feet and at high speed, a maneuver that required emergency action by the American ship to avoid a collision. Incidents like this illustrated the friction inherent in operating large numbers of ships and aircraft in close proximity in contested waters, and they raised genuine questions about whether an accident could trigger a crisis that neither side had intended. The management of these incidents, how both sides responded, de-escalated, and communicated through the dangerous moments, was itself an important dimension of the dual-carrier story. Both the United States and China had an interest in avoiding an accidental conflict, even as they competed intensely for regional position. The two sides maintained military-to-military communication channels that were specifically designed to manage crisis incidents. But those channels were imperfect, and the history of the period includes multiple moments when the management of a potentially dangerous incident required rapid decisions by officers at sea who were operating with incomplete information and under significant pressure. As we approach 2025, the dual-carrier concept has become institutionalized in American Pacific strategy in a way that it was not in 2017. What began as a crisis response tool, deployed primarily to signal resolve during the North Korean nuclear crisis, has evolved into a routine feature of American naval presence in the region, employed across a range of circumstances and serving multiple simultaneous strategic purposes. The exercises are more frequent, more complex, more allied integrated, and more publicly communicated than they were 8 years ago. The operational concepts have matured. The Navy has identified the command and control arrangements, the logistics frameworks, and the training pipelines that make dual-carrier operations sustainable over time rather than heroic one-time events. But the strategic question of whether they are working, whether they are actually deterring Chinese military action and maintaining regional stability, remains genuinely contested. Supporters of the approach point to the fact that China has not used military force against Taiwan, has not succeeded in displacing American military presence from the Western Pacific, and has not been able to convert its military investments into political dominance of the region. The carriers, they argue, are part of the reason why. Skeptics argue that the relevant variable is not whether war has occurred. War has not occurred because neither China nor the United States wants one, but whether American carrier operations have actually shaped Chinese decision-making, or whether China has simply decided on its own timeline and for its own reasons to grow its military power while avoiding direct confrontation with the United States for now? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, because we do not have access to the deliberations inside Zongnanhai where those decisions are made. What we do know is that the Western Pacific in 2025 is a more heavily militarized space than it was in 2017. Both the United States and China have invested enormously in their respective military capabilities. American carriers are more capable than they were 8 years ago, but Chinese anti-ship capabilities are also more capable. The Allies are better integrated into American operational frameworks, but China's military has also developed more sophisticated joint operational capabilities. The region is safer in some ways. Both sides have developed more experience managing dangerous incidents, and the channels for crisis communication have been exercised repeatedly. But it is also more dangerous in other ways. The capabilities on both sides are greater, the political stakes around Taiwan have intensified, and the margin for error in a real crisis has narrowed. The story of dual-carrier operations in the Western Pacific between 2017 and 2025 is ultimately a story about the limits and possibilities of military power as a tool of strategic communication. It is a story about the extraordinary complexity of signaling resolve to multiple audiences simultaneously. Pyongyang and Beijing and Tokyo and Seoul and Taipei all watching the same ships move across the same ocean and drawing different conclusions from what they see. It is a story about technology and alliance and geography and risk management. And it is a story that is not over. The next chapter of this story is being written right now. In the waters of the Philippine Sea and the South China Sea, in the flight operations of carrier air wings that practice, day after day, the skills that would be needed if deterrence ever fails. The men and women who sail on these ships and fly from their decks do not typically describe their work in geopolitical terms. They talk about the professionalism of keeping an aircraft carrier's flight deck safe during night operations. They talk about the complexity of refueling a strike fighter at night using a hose deployed from another aircraft. They talk about the months away from their families and the particular quality of sunrise seen from a flight deck in the middle of the Philippine Sea with no land visible in any direction. But the work they do, the extraordinary operational competence they demonstrate day after day, is the foundation on which the entire architecture of Pacific deterrence rests. Without that operational excellence, the strategic message of dual carrier presence would be empty. It is their professionalism that gives the signal its credibility. And that, perhaps, is the deepest truth about dual carrier operations in the Western Pacific. The ships and the aircraft and the missiles are all visible. The strategy and the signaling and the geopolitical calculation are discussable and debatable. But the invisible foundation of all of it is human skill, human courage, and human commitment. The willingness of thousands of people to deploy to the most strategically complex body of water on Earth, to operate at the edge of their capabilities in an environment where mistakes can be catastrophic, and to do it again and again, year after year, as a gift to the stability of a region that contains more than half the world's population and the majority of its economic growth. That is the story of dual carrier operations in the Western Pacific. And the question it leaves us with, the question that every person watching these ships maneuver across the Pacific should be asking, is one that does not have an easy answer, but that we owe it to ourselves to take seriously, because the answer matters for the future of the entire world. So here is the question I want to leave with you today. If you were the commander of American naval forces in the Pacific, and you had to decide whether to sail 2 carriers into the South China Sea tomorrow morning, knowing that China's military would respond aggressively, knowing that an incident at sea could escalate in ways that neither side could fully control, and knowing that the credibility of American deterrence depends on your willingness to accept that risk, what would you do? And if you find that question genuinely difficult to answer, you have just understood something important about the world we live in. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this kind of deep dive military history is what you are here for, Please hit that subscribe button right now because this channel exists for exactly one purpose: to give you the most serious, detailed, and honest analysis of the military forces and strategic decisions that are shaping our world. Like this video if it gave you something to think about. Share it with someone who cares about these questions. And I will see you in the next one.